Well, time now for a look at the economic week ahead with Rofhiwa Madzena. Rofhiwa, always a pleasure speaking to you. Let's talk a little bit about retail sales, which are out this week. Will they show that consumers are in a better position?
Well, Faith, that's going to be the interesting thing coming out of the numbers of this week. So what we saw when we had the GDP figures come out last week, which was pretty important because it showed that there was growth that was better than expected. It showed that household expenditure had increased, and that means that people were spending a little bit more money than they usually would. And of course, a component of growth within an economy is the consumer's ability to spend. So what we'll see here in these numbers that are set to come out this week, according to analysts, is that there will be a marginal uptick of consumer spending. But you must remember that even though we're going to see an improvement in this particular reporting period, it is going to be coming off a low base. So we're coming off a base where consumers in the last year or so have been constrained and have really struggled with the impact of COVID-19, many getting retrenched, many getting their salaries cut and not having as much buying power as they usually have. But of course, the festive season, the opening up of the economy after the second wave in January or the first quarter this year, showing that consumers are a little bit more confident with their spending habits, and so we'll see a little bit of an uptick in that regard.
And Alexandra Forbes releasing results this week, and they'll show that it's been tough for consumers.
That's right. And insurance companies in particular, Faith, have had a really tough time. Alex Forbes, they are not having a better time. So we did see that companies like Alex Forbes saw a whole new overhaul of the insurance industry when we saw the COVID-19 pandemic hit, where a lot of them had to learn on the go in terms of how to deal with certain claimants, certain disasters that were coming along. And like other insurers, they were obviously going to be affected. And so they're going to be reporting some results or some financials that aren't going to be as impressive as any shareholder or investor in Alex Forbes would be expecting in this particular period. But they do indicate that the road to recovery is a good path and that they are confident in terms of direction that the South African economy is taking. And also, interestingly, Faith, what you would see in other insurance companies, which I'm sure will reflect in these particular numbers, is that during the pandemic, a lot more consumers were taking on insurance. So they were protecting themselves in any way possible should a disaster of this magnitude happen once again.
Sure. And also we've got the G7 summit that has concluded, but President Cyril Ramaphosa had a few words to share. What has he been saying?
Well, Faith, I think one of the big things that he's been talking about with the big leaders is this idea of making vaccines available to developing nations like South Africa and the rest of the African continent. And the fact that we don't necessarily have the funding to get those vaccines on the African continent. So partnerships and bilateral agreements being made in terms of making those vaccines available, vaccinating as many Africans as possible so that economies can be reopened. We know that a lot of European, American countries have South Africa and other African countries on red flag lists in terms of travel because of our vaccination rate or the lack thereof. And so it's quite important that we are getting vaccinated and that we are opening up important industries like tourism once again. Another one, Faith, which I think he had some ammunition when he spoke about this in particular, is the fact that South Africa is open for business. South Africa is open for investment. Last week, huge announcements were made about Eskom and SAA. Eskom, where independent power producers are going to be allowed to produce 100 megawatts of power. They were asking for just 50. That is a huge move in terms of decisiveness of government. And then another big one, that 51% of SAA is now going to be owned by a consortium alongside government. So that shows huge policy certainty in terms of the direction that government is taking, something that global players are watching closely, and that really just builds confidence in our policy direction and really attracting the kind of investment that the president would have been talking about in his visit at the G7 summit.
Yeah, well, Rofhiwa, let's stay with this theme of investments as well as business. Tell us exactly what can we expect this week when it comes to the markets?
Well, it's going to be an interesting week. So the week ended off on some mixed economic data coming out of the world's big economies, that being China, the US, and Europe. So in the Eurozone, we saw inflation data coming out of China as well, inflation data. Markets were not too happy about that. US economic data also not impressive, but what it did do is strengthen the US dollar, and that in turn, you would have seen had a very negative impact on the rand, which last week at this time was trading at around 13 Rand 40 cents, and this week is now at around 13 Rand 60 to 69 cents. So economic data globally having a negative impact on the local unit, but you will see this week, given what we're seeing opening in the Asian markets, the JSE always follows suits with Asian and European markets, and we might have a positive start to the week, given what we've been seeing despite the economic data. Financial markets performing well because of your tech stocks as well as financial stocks, given that renewed optimism about global economic recovery.
Well, on that optimistic note, Rofhiwa, we'll leave it there for this evening. Rofhiwa Madzena, they're giving us a look at the economic week ahead.